I'm Oscar Holmes IV. I am honored to moderate this panel. We have a group of people who need no introduction, but I would just highlight who they are and their position. To my immediate left, we have Robin Ely, the Diane Wilson Professor of Business Administration here at Harvard Business School. Beside her, we have Ashleigh Shelby Rosette, Associate Professor at Duke University. And beside her, we have Melissa Thomas Hunt, Vice Provost for Inclusion, Excellence, and Professor of Management at Vanderbilt. So I was told that Melissa has to leave at 1:30, so please don't think that she's being disrespectful, but she has to lead the panel. So we're going to start off by my asking some questions to the panelists, but we want to make this interactive as well, so we will also open the floor to all of you to ask some questions of this wonderful panel. And the discussion is about publishing race research for academic and general audiences. So Melissa, I'll start with the first question with you, since you have to leave us soon. So can you recount an experience that was your most pleasant and then your worst publishing experience in terms of publishing race research? So I wanted to start off positively first. So your most pleasant experience, but then perhaps your worst as well in terms of publishing race research.
So I have to give a shout out.
Okay, we like shout outs.
So there was some work, probably now, oh goodness, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that I embarked upon when I was an assistant professor at Cornell at the Johnson School, and I was working with some doctoral students on it. And we got some really, what we thought were really interesting findings, and it was the intersection of race and prestige of educational background on the way in which valuation decisions were made of leaders of firms. And we had a draft of a paper, and I had no idea who was going to be interested in this work at that time. There wasn't a lot in the management space. And I sent a draft of the paper to David Thomas. And David said, I want you to present at HBS. And that meant a lot to me. It was really an inflection point in my publishing and in my confidence. And then went on to get it published at Organization Science. And so I talk about that because it was actually that email response that was validating, and then the ability to come here, present the work, and then there were others who helped to move that through, and that was my most positive. Challenging. I mean, there are lots of rejections all the time and continuing, and it's always hard. And you read it, and there's one set of reactions, and you think they don't understand, and then there's hard feedback, given also by other people in this room. I actually do believe in the process, but I also believe that you have to trust your own work and trust that you have insights, and you have to elucidate the importance of those insights for the people who are reviewing your papers.
Okay. Ashleigh or Rob?
My best experience,
okay,
I think, would probably be my first published diversity paper. It was difficult, but I had the right associate editor. So Catherine Klein was the associate editor for that paper, and there's just a huge sense of accomplishment. I think I kind of took a risk by changing my dissertation at the last minute from negotiations to privilege and diversity, and I wasn't quite sure that I kind of whether it was going to pay off or not. But to have that first paper published and to have such an engaging associate editor and encouraging, I think is probably I'd probably count that as my best experience.
Okay. No one wants to talk about their worst experience.
I know. So I think I'd probably echo Melissa in terms of the worst for me. I don't know that I can point to a single worst experience. I would probably say it is that review that you get about your work that is not critical of the work or the robustness or the rigor, but it's a naysayer that makes it based upon their own personal opinions. So those are probably the most frustrating, and I would love to say that that would only be one occurrence, but it has occurred multiple times. In fact, I just got one of those this past week. So I think those are probably the most difficult publishing, one of the most difficult aspects of the publishing process. So.
Robin?
I think my best experience publishing was probably publishing the paper with David on diversity perspectives. I don't remember the name of it, but it had something about diversity perspectives. What was, I mean, you'll start to see a theme here. What made it really a great experience was Rod Kramer was my editor at ASQ, and he was amazing. And it was the best, I mean, like, the most supportive editorial, you know, R&R letter that I think I've ever seen. And I had 2 of my 3 reviewers were super positive. So, like, you know, wow, when do you get that? So that was a great experience. And, you know, we had to deal with various, you know, pretty minor things. The 3rd reviewer wasn't very happy with the paper initially, but and Rod said, just, you know, address the things that reviewer 3 is asking you to address, and, you know, you'll be fine. And so we did, and there it was. It was pretty easy. So that was my best experience. Yeah. So the worst experience. I think the worst experience was. I really love all of my papers, so I fall in love with them, whether they're, you know, great or not. I don't write very many papers, and I spend a lot of time writing a paper, so I get very committed to it and the ideas and where I want to have it published. And so that's probably not such a great thing to do that, but I do. And so I think my worst experience was trying to get my offshore oil platform with Deb Meyerson published. It was incredibly painful, with ultimately, I think there were 4 rounds of revisions at ASQ. At least one of them was a reject and resubmit. There might have been 2, maybe there were 5 rounds. I can't remember. We had at least 2 rounds of reviewers. It was very stressful for me and Deb. It was stressful on our relationship. It's a testament to us and our friendship that we hung in there together, but it was very, very hard. And then, you know, ultimately was rejected. And so Art Brief, bless his heart, was always standing there saying, I'll take it, I love that paper, just put it in ROB. And it's like, well, I didn't want it to be an ROB. ROB isn't even an empirical journal. You know, like, why would it go in ROB? It's like, it doesn't matter. We've had empirical papers in here before. And so, you know, then it became, we decided to do that. And then ASQ kind of came around again and said we could have another shot with a different set of reviewers and a different editor. And again, I mean, it was like John Wagner was the editor. It was not a good experience with John. I know some people have good experiences with him. I didn't, and so you know, it's all kind of wrapped up in that. But that was very hard rejection.
So what is the process that you go through to craft phenomena-related research ideas and turn them into high-quality research papers that make really impactful theoretical contributions? Can you talk about that process? Particularly as is related to diversity research. Many times it could be phenomenon-based.
So the work of mine that I love the most is based on phenomena or observations that I make, that my sense is that there's no one theory that explains it. Mm-hmm. And trying to look at the intersection of theories to explain that which is not implausible, but has thus far been unexplained. And so the twists in it. The inspiration comes from all different sorts of places. The unconscious bias paper with Michelle Duguid, where we find that prevalence of making people aware of the prevalence of unconscious bias can actually diminish their motivation to work against it, and therefore they stereotype more in some instances, came from a talk that Bob Cialdini was giving many, many years ago at Stanford, where he's talking about his and others' work in the national parks and descriptive norms. And the light bulb went on that by talking about the prevalence of unconscious bias, we are essentially evoking a descriptive norm that everybody stereotypes, and so we do what other people do. And so just being open to the possibility and questioning when things don't make sense, and then looking for alternative explanations, and then beginning to test it. The other thing I will say is, sometimes I'm an experimentalist, and because I love the causality of it, and sometimes we get things that we completely don't understand, and rather than just throwing it away and saying, oh, that wasn't good enough, really wrestling to understand, like, what didn't we manipulate, or what were the unintended consequences, and really understanding that and finding alternative ways to then try and make adjustments and test that again. So not to give up on it.
I'd say most of my research is phenomenon-based. I think I'm much more driven by, observing something and wow, that's interesting, or dinner table conversations. I have really enjoyed testing things that have kind of been in the stratosphere. We've been talking about them for years, and we just say, hey, let's go test it. And so for me, the process mostly starts with the phenomenon. And I think similar to Melissa, we have the phenomenon. Okay, now how are we going to test this? Well, the phenomenon, now what's the research question? Now how are we going to test this? And then going to the literature, trying to design something, going back to the literature, trying to design something. So it's this iterative process. But I'd probably say, I don't think that it's any more different than most research that's out there in terms of trying to, develop it and get it ultimately, get the findings and ultimately published. And so I think the only difference is that just excitement and that initial question, and you just get so excited that wow, let's go test this. You're engaged in a conversation with someone, and then you're like, wow, we shouldn't just be talking about this. What are we going to do? How are we going to? And so that aspect of it is just the excitement, and then I don't think the process would be any different than any other paper in terms of the iterative going back and forth and iterative process.
So are you both mostly experimental?
I am.
And Ashleigh, the work I know of yours is experimental.
Yes, I'd say much of it is.
Yeah.
Much of it is. I don't know if I'd define myself as an experimentalist necessarily, because I'll dib and dab in all types of methodology. So, but some.
Yeah, because it's interesting because I do. I've been most successful, I think, in my. I've never done. No, that's not true. I did an experiment once, and it got published, but every time I try to do an experiment, like the process that you just described, there's a phenomenon and you think it's really interesting, and then you try to come up with a design to test it. It's that testing part where I have had a hard time, and Lakshmi knows we've been working on a couple of different things we've been wanting to test, and I think that at the end of the day, probably the things I'm interested in and the things that I've been more successful writing, doing research on, and getting published are more, they are phenomenon based, and it's more either noticing something in my own life that I think I have an idea about. First of all, I think it's interesting. Nobody seems to be able to explain it, so I design a study to go research it, to investigate it. I do have a couple of studies where there were hypotheses. They weren't experiments, but they were more like that, where you go out and you test hypotheses. But even that came from my own observations of stuff around me, and thinking, wow, I think what's making a difference here, what's going to explain this variability is X, and then going and finding in the field places where that variability exists, and in that sense testing it. But for the most part, it's like seeing something in the field and then finding it really interesting and thinking, what's the research question that I have about this phenomenon? And then thinking, so I start with the phenomenon, the research question, and then going to the literature to see what would be an interesting frame on this question. And that is a very iterative process, and then along with data collection. So what's the data collection designed to address this question? You start collecting data, and and it just kind of evolves from there to the point where I could be changing my research question in an R&R even. I, in fact, just did that on a second R&R. You keep refining the research question. We already have the data, right? But it's not quite framed around the right research question to really invoke the right literature to frame what the findings are. So that's kind of how I tend to go about it.
So this is not a predetermined question, but what you just said led me to ask this question about what are your thoughts about harking in terms of when people hypothesize after they have results, and how do you think they relate to some of the research that's being published in this area? Do you think it's a problem, or do you think some of the editorials that have come out are too far on the criticism side?
Are you talking about p-hacking?
Or just
kind of
when
thing?
people already have the results and they start to hypothesize post data collection, the harking?
I think that
Arguments.
pertains primarily to quantitative hypothesis testing research, right?
Yeah,
so-
definitely
Right.
quantitative. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll let my more. I mean, I've done some of that work. I'm less connected to that debate because my research, I feel, isn't really.
Right.
It's not, that debate's not relevant to what I do.
Yeah, I'm going to let Melissa take this.
Nobody wants to touch that.
This goes back. I was alluding to this
I have
notion.
a point of view about it, but it's not.
Right,
mine,
right.
so.
I was alluding to this, that sometimes you don't get the results that you are expecting,
Right.
And I think particularly when you're in the realm of studying race, we don't necessarily have the theories. We don't have the richness of knowledge base. The individuals who are doing that work can't necessarily draw upon it. And so we need to enrich the way we think about it. And so I believe that absolutely you should revise your hypotheses. Now, so we revise our hypotheses and then we test them again. But so I see it very much as being that iterative process. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I mean, I would pretty much echo, and I yield to Melissa only because she is like true the experimentalist. But I think that's very correct, and that is, as I mentioned, a lot of my research is phenomenon based, and so that means that you observe something, you think that something is going to happen, and then you test it. That may or may not happen, and then you test it again, and then you test it, and then you try to replicate it to make sure it wasn't a fluke, and you try to replicate it again. And so it really is this iterative process. And so whether you describe that as harking, it's one side of the debate versus another side of the debate in terms of, but if you have the idea, how fully formed is any idea when you initially start, the research such that you can make the prediction that's going to, like completely come out. If we had that, I mean, we'd probably have a gazillion publications. And so it really is this iterative process, but still doing that iterative process with a great deal of integrity, making sure that you replicate it and that you use that initial study to enlighten you, to show you, the possibilities, and then go and start diving deeper.
Okay. So are there any methods, old or new, that you would like to see scholars take up more often in doing race research? And then are there any methods, old or new, that you think we should retire at this point?
Who am I to say, what someone should or shouldn't do, what some methodologies are not doing? I tell you, what I'm finding really cool right now that I am really enjoying, and that is learning a little bit from the economists with regards to their methodologies. The economists have some really cool tools that I think we as diversity scholars can benefit from. They lack, and I apologize if there are any economists in the room, they sometimes lack a little theory, right? And so we have been, in organizational behavior and social psych and management, we have been developing quite a lot of theories in this realm. And so kind of fusing those two, their kind of cutting edge methodologies with our, overarching ideas in terms of what we've learned so far, I think is a really ripe area for research. But in terms of what we should or should not see, I don't necessarily
Or you would like to
know.
see more of that, so.
Yeah, well, actually, I don't know that it's being done, to be honest. So I would like to see it be, taken on. So, yeah.
I think I would like to see fewer MTurk studies. I think that what I've seen in my doctoral students, for example, who do experimental work, I started to learn from their experience. 'Cause as I said, I'm not an experimentalist, but what I worry about with MTurk is that it is not a powerful. It's not really a method, but it's not a powerful data source. And what you can test in an MTurk study with very much power is not a lot. And so if you've got a question that really lends itself, and I think many interesting questions do, to an MTurk type study as your start, I think that's great. But I think we have tended to gravitate to MTurk too soon, tried manipulation, it doesn't work. Like I started thinking, you're not allowed to drop or change a hypothesis because it didn't work in MTurk. You had a good idea, don't get discouraged because MTurk didn't, your study, your findings didn't support it, or your findings supported something else that isn't actually that central to what you're interested in, and it's kind of hard to theorize about, but you kind of go there because it's a finding, maybe it's even a replicable finding. That worries me a little bit, is being too, and honestly, I think it was something that was, when MTurk first was available, it seemed like amazing, and it really did. It was such an opportunity. I think we are all now seeing the limits of MTurk, so I think there's value to it, but so that would be my.
Speaking
Can
of
I
a,
just chime
oh, sure.
on the MTurk debate? So I think there's a great deal of value in terms of using MTurk studies, but I do believe if you are a diversity scholar, you have to be very, very careful with regards to utilizing MTurk, and that if you are attempting to utilize this as a platform in which to collect data, these are professional. These are people who are using MTurk all the time, right? That are, they're getting paid to do this all the time. And they see certain studies, quite frequently. And so race studies kind of become somewhat, I don't want to say obvious, but you have to design the study such that it circumvents a certain level of obviousness to the MTurker. And if you don't, as Robin is describing, you will have this greatly designed study and it doesn't work, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to abandon the study because it didn't work on the MTurkers. And I think diversity research specifically lends itself to this potential rejection because, when the MTurker sees, a black face, or they see, a white face, or they see a woman, or they're trying to, not to say there are demand characteristics there, but they probably are to an extent. So I would say with regards to diversity research, there definitely are limitations, but I probably am not as critical overall as using MTurk as Robin is.
Well, I just want to be clear that I think there's some great MTurk studies, and I think Rachel's use of MTurk in her dissertation was brilliant, and so you should take a look at it. It was an appropriate methodology, and the way you used it was very creative, and so it's not about MTurk per se.
Yeah, speaking of Blackish moments during the conference, I think I saw like a collective grasping of pearls when Robin said that. That was very Blackish. Everybody was like, So I have more questions, but we would like to open up the floor to get some of your questions. And, well, they already have some. Courtney, Bernardo, Ashleigh.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was a pearl grabber. And mainly it's because when doing diversity work, the hardest thing I find with theory and data is where are they, right? It's like I want to be able to understand what a work experience is like for a black person. Where can I find them, right? Because they're not overrepresented in companies, so my N is always going to be low if I look at company X. So I find MTurk as one way, and now there's Turk Prime, if people don't know about Turk Prime, which is the more academic, rigorous, they can find people for you and validated workers who are not just doing MTurk for MTurk's sake. So there's levels to MTurk now. But also just in general, like, where do you go to find these people that you want to theorize about, specifically thinking about Black work experiences when they are so underrepresented in certain occupations, and then the occupations that they're not underrepresented in don't have access to handheld devices or laptops in their day-to-day work where we tend to collect data from. So how do we do that in our work moving forward?
I don't know that I have a specific answer. Much of my research is about the perception, right? So that means that I have a broader, sample from which to choose. So my sample is not necessarily Black women, but I'm going towards that more, but in the past it has not been. And there have been opportunities. We have Sandra, who is here in the audience, and that would be, an opportunity. You kind of, when you get to know like the various diversity officers, they can give you access to affinity groups. So if you're teaching in executive MBAs and you have teaching in executive MBA programs and you have students, utilize them. You are MBA students who come to you and say that, and this just happens often. I mean, many women in the room, many racial minorities in the room. Your students are going to come to you and they're going to talk to you. The Black women are come to talk to the Black women, the women come to talk to the women. Well, those women graduate, right? And then they start working and they get access. And so utilizing, those areas, it is a bit of being an opportunist, but we have to take those opportunities where they present themselves. And that's where I found a bit of success recently, now that I'm moving more from the perceptual to the actual experience in some of my work.
I was just going to reiterate, Sandra has a whole organization that she runs. It's a membership organization for Black women. So if you're interested in studying Black women, you might convince Sandra to give you access to her group. And I know Robert Livingston, this is where, and I think that was a paper with you, or a study with you anyway, was using that population. And most industries have organizations for different, ethnic groups, in particular Black or African American employees or people in that field, Black lawyers, Black accountants. So that if you're really looking for a place that, now the downside of that is they aren't necessarily in the context of an organization. I usually like to study people kind of in situ, and I've ended up studying racially diverse organizations because my research questions have taken me to those organizations. So that's how you get a pretty good sample of people of color anyway, is just to go into an organization that already is diverse.
But also, I'm a catalyst, and we're a member organization with many different corporations, so I can't guarantee it, but if you were to work with a researcher in the research department, it's possible that you could have access to data from those organizations.
And I would just put a plug in for the accounting firms. The accounting firms are huge. They are not super diverse, but they're huge, so you can get pretty big samples of just about any subgroup of professionals that you're interested in. And the accounting firms also have, as we heard from one today from PwC, they have their HR programs, and they have really, really very sophisticated diversity officers who are in charge of that. And I know some of them, probably other people do too, so if you think that might be a route you want to go, call in on your network of people who do studies in organizations. I just think the Big Four are great, so.
And
Alumni too.
Yeah.
For all institutions where we have pretty big alumni bases, we have an African American Alumni Association that dates back for years and years and years, and those are great repository because you get people with all different types of background, but we know that they have,
Some commonality, yeah.
Stephanie?
Yeah, so my question is about making Black and race figure in a paper versus just calling it minorities, right? So I've had an issue in a review process previously where the reviewer, and it sort of speaks to Ashleigh's point about putting themselves and trying to see themselves in the data, where it was clearly, and it worked out in the end, but I'm not sure we addressed it in the most effective way. I think they kind of gave up. But we wanted to talk about women of color in particular. And I think they were encouraging us to sort of make it be much more expansive in our theorizing and to speak to the whole minority experiences versus women of color. This really drives me crazy, right? And I think even for the paper that I presented today, I really want this to be about black versus white. I really want it to be about what it's about. I don't want to have to call it the minority experience, right? So I want to know if you've had, because both of you have written, published about this, if you've had that challenge, if somebody has asked you to sort of extrapolate to the whole minority experiences, to cloak that in any way, and how you addressed it. Because I don't feel like I have an effective strategy, but I do know that that happens when people are thinking, well, I don't think that's just about race. I think that's about like all minorities, right? And that happens, so.
So I haven't had that specific experience, Stephanie, where they have asked me to broaden, the applicability in terms of, who my target population that I'm studying. I probably had the reverse, and that was probably my own restricting myself, only because I had to learn how to write about race such that it could be received by a broader audience. And I think because initially I was writing in a way that probably bordered on advocacy, right, with regards to the Black experience, I ended up having to temper my language and making it more broad, but still staying true to my original intention. And so I'm glad to hear that it worked out in the end, but I would say get the work published. Get the work published, period. If you have to be just a little bit broader in order to get the idea out there, but still staying true, whether it's the discussion, whether it's saying it is broad, but I'm really talking about this, there's still caveats and ways to do it to both, I think, meet the requirement, the request, but also staying true to yourself. What I would not encourage you to do in that is, and say, either I'm going to get it done this way, and it's going to be talking about Blacks, and that's it, or I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to go to another journal, and it ends up this process. I would not encourage you to do that, because the goal is to get the ideas out there. And if it does not cause you to sacrifice the overarching phenomenon, the finding, if you have to tweak the presentation of it in order to get it published, I'm not going to be one that's going to be opposed to that, because we need the work out there.
I would just reiterate, discussion sections are fantastic for that. And you know what? A lot of times those things end up coming out by the time it gets published anyway. That's been my experience. You put this stuff in there to satisfy a reviewer, then there's no reviewers, and it's just you and the managing editor, and it's like, do you think that's really that important to put in there? And she says, not really. And it's like, great, let's shorten it. And out it goes. That's totally fine. But I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. It's like lip service, and it actually could be helpful. I would never say anything that wasn't true or that I thought was, but all that, so I just think I would totally agree.
Bernardo?
So first of all, thank you for doing this panel. This is great culmination to an amazing conference. And I wanted to build on this topic. So I have comments, which I hope you'll let me do, and hopefully you'll comment back. Race and learning about and from the Black experience, I think that's so critical in this, and that's what I'm hoping we can get some more insight on about the publishing process and the implications, not just in terms of the practical stuff, which is so important, but also what does that mean in terms of the dynamics and structures and experiences that we've been talking about for a day and a half, because this is very much part of the whole thing. In my own career, one of the things that's been important to me is thinking about diversity broadly, but also distinguishing between the different kinds of groups and different kinds of experiences, and also looking at within group diversity as well. And then when you think about race as a process, I want to channel Stella and Como a little bit, is the idea that I think we need to really interrogate, to use the language from yesterday, we really need to interrogate the process of racing, of creating race, of constructing it. And how do we do that in our own academic work and in the ways that we translate that for practice and for practitioners? I think these days is a lot, with the internet, there's so much of this stuff just being synthesized and pre-digested, and people just get, like a headline on Twitter or like the HBR, blog version of things or whatever it is, right? So people don't even get the whole thing. And so what's great about this event and really thinking about more deeply is trying to figure out, well, what is the Black experience? What can we learn from that? What can we say about that in a way that does help us understand these larger processes, but doesn't dilute the specifics of that? Just like we were dealing with some of the messiness for 25 minutes yesterday in the large group, right? I mean, how do we get that nuance and that messiness back into our publications, into our way we think about them, how we set them up, right? Of course, everybody has this career needs to get published and so on, but in what ways are you going to use that as a subversive thing to really change the system? How do you get in your own work and in the publications, in your role, keep in mind the larger issues and the calling that we're here to do, right? If that's what it is. I mean, for some people it's one thing, for others it's another. So what's your advice in a way to people about how to manage all of that? Beyond, I thought your point was really good about, get it published, but depends for me what you're gonna do and how diluted it's gonna be, right? If it's gonna be used in a way that undermines equality or social justice or whatever, do we wanna do that or not, right? Or what are the pros and cons? So how do we manage this? What do we need to know about publishing about and in ways that learn about and from the Black experience and actually look at race as a social construct and how we do race in this country, in the world, and how can we do it better through our work?
So first, if by any stretch of the imagination, I indicated that you should dilute your work, that was not the, not necessarily the intention. And I think, Bernardo, in terms of what is the intention, we got to get it out there first. We don't have as many liberties as we would like to have with regards to publishing race research. I would probably akin it to maybe the development of gender research, and maybe Robin can, kind of lean in on this, and that is because, the gender research has a bit of a head start, right? This is like the early 1970s when, this work is initially going, and I'd probably say that, Bernardo, if you can see the kind of flowering of that work where they started to get messy when they started to have a large enough contingent that was working on this work and getting it published. So as that contingent starts to swell, you start to get certain liberties and you can take on the very thorny issues that are out there because there's almost an implicit acceptance of these ideas as the number in publications start to increase. And then that becomes more of a, I don't want to say an advocate role, but you have liberties with regards to being more, this is what we should do, when there's much more research out there. With regards to race research, we're still back here, right? I think of if I had to think of one of the more seminal papers, we're talking about, David's work and Stella's work and Taylor Cox's work, which is in the early, 1990s is when this stuff is published. So we aren't that far away. And if we look at that, there hasn't been this groundswell. To be here is just amazing. But, with regards to where the research is being published, it's being published in Europe. It's been published in social psychology, but our management journals, the numbers aren't there. And I know this because I looked at 853 articles on gender and leadership and race, and they weren't being published in management journals. So I think the first thing is to have the liberty. We get that liberty once we start getting the publications. I just simply don't know if we are there yet.
So I don't know that. I'd not thought about it the way you're saying, and I have to think about that. I think that there are fewer people doing work on race than are doing work on gender. I don't know if, submission for submission, race work is any harder to get published than gender work? I mean, it's an empirical question. I would be interested very much to know the answer to that question, and maybe we could do something to find out about it, because I think it's a perception, and I really just don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's not true that, again, submission for submission, and maybe what's happening, and I think this is less happening on the gender side now, people are, I hope, no longer being discouraged by people, I mean doctoral students and young faculty, being discouraged from doing work in this area, whether it's gender or race or diversity or identity, power, all these things that we write about. There are people, well, for a long time people were I was discouraged. Don't write your dissertation on gender, you'll never get a job. And it's just not true. And so, are you getting discouraged from doing work on race? And maybe is that why if we are seeing, relatively speaking, fewer submissions by people who are trying to publish about race relative to any other topic? I don't really know, because that might be where it is. It's like, I'd like to write something about race, but I'm afraid to, and so I'm going to frame it as something else, or I'm going to do the experiment on a different identity so that it's not so hot as race. But the problem is, if you're not studying race, you're not studying race. You're studying that other thing. And it might be related to race in some kind of theoretical way, possibly, but it's not race. So, so I do think it's an empirical question as to whether it is still hard to get this work published. I think what really helps is people who agree to review papers on race and developing people to know how to review in a sophisticated way papers about race. I can tell you this is something that a small group of us are doing around systems psychodynamics as an area of research that some of us would like to see back in the mainstream of work being published in our field. It's something that people wrote about in the 70s and 80s a little bit, and now we're seeing it again. We're partly seeing it again because we are taking it upon ourselves to get together, find people who would be sympathetic to this view, educate them, and then say, send it to so-and-so, send it to so-and-so. You don't know how to, you send it to it, and you find editors who are sympathetic and are willing to send the papers to people who are sophisticated enough to be able to help you, because of course the first submission, is going to need some work. So I think there might be a strategy around that. I don't know.
So just to kind of give so there is a small study on this with regards to, I think it's Eden King, Derek Avery, Mickey Hebel, and Jose Cortina in their Journal of Management editorial, and I know that Oscar is familiar with this, that actually kind of systematically looked at, whether or not there is bias in the review process, and did have some very interesting findings with regards to the review process and where the bias takes place. So we do have some insight with regards to, it occurs further in the review process. So if you look at it, as he's talking about the second review, if you look at it and say, comparing this with diversity work to other topics that are out there in terms of acceptance rates, there's not that big of a difference. But what they showed is that the diversity papers had to work harder to get to the third round.
Totally
Now, if they got to the third
Absolutely.
round, they were successful. But if they did not get to that third round, that's where a lot.
So
of
they weren't given the opportunity to go to the third round to get it to the point that it needed to be gotten to.
Mostly, right.
That makes sense to me, and it's just a kind of parallel process of what we've been talking about in here for the last couple of days. You just have to be a lot better.
I had a question. This is kind of going similar to something that you actually said earlier, Ashleigh, about like people doing things in psych, and then like when you're talking about like psychologists and economists coming together. In a lot of business schools, there are people publishing in like psych journals as well, and sociology journals as well as like our mainstream, like more OB-ish and management journals. And I was just wondering, just in terms of thinking about like a lot of the theories of like race and gender, like in psychology, and in sociology versus how we think about it in the more general mainstream management. I would love to hear more about, just in terms of our training at business schools in the field and how we think about disciplinary versus interdisciplinary, and what are some of the challenges, especially for in some of the more mainstream albeit management type writing journals, challenges and opportunities of how we think about disciplinary work and methodologies in terms of how we approach race and leadership.
So, I think in management, again, we're still in the infant stages. I think, we have a couple of things that we can point to, but we borrow a lot from the disciplines. Social psychology, social psychology, sociology, political science. We borrow a lot their methodologies. We borrow their theoretical perspectives. And so, but I think we have to go to where it is. And we have to go to where they're studying this and to bring it into, our domain. And I think that's what we are attempting to do. I know many of us in this room, with regards to the research questions that we've gone to, you go into the management journals and you only see a couple of articles, that are written, or you have to take a theory that's not about race and then make it about race. So we have to kind of be creative with regards to, the work that we're doing, I think, in the management area. But I think there are immense opportunities for bridging, these types of, these various disciplines to say much more about race, because we really are only at the very beginning. And to speak to Bernardo's question, ultimately the goal is to enact change. Right? That's ultimately our goal, to inform people so that we can make better decisions, so we can have more equality, less inequity. The goal is to ultimately enact some type of change. But we have to have the theory and we have to have the empirical research in order to be convincing, such that change does follow. And so wherever the discipline, or whatever the discipline, let's go and figure out what they're doing and bring it all in and say here, so that we can give the best message out there with regards to race research.
So we know the conversations don't end here, and we know a lot of people need to catch flights. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Robin Ely, Ashleigh, Rosette, Mr. Comic-Con.